Hello, I'm Rachel from Douentza Garden in Ireland, and you are very welcome to this video on the top 5 garden plants I wish I'd never planted. Now, I would have liked to do this video outdoors, but it's raining today, so I'm here in the shelter of the greenhouse, but we will be going out there to see these top 5 offenders. Now, this is a collab video with Una from the channel Granny's Garden in Spain. So you'll be hearing 3 of my top pet hates in this video and 2 of Una's. And then you're going to jump over to Una's channel to check out the rest of the video, her other 3 and my top 2. Okay, let's get on with the video. Before we start on this video on my top 5 plants I wish I'd never planted, I just want to give you a little preamble, and it's to say that over the course of my gardening years, which has been a number of decades, I have experimented a lot. I've grown a lot of stuff from seed. I have bought things and planted them without having done the proper research. We all do it. And for the vast majority of these plants, they've been great. Some have given me amazing surprises by how brilliant they were as garden plants and how beautifully they flowered. And others I didn't like so much, and I did get rid of them over the course of time and have long forgotten it. But today's 5 are a little bit different, and they're a little bit different because although they have a lot of positive things about them, and we will start off by talking about the positive, they also have a downside that I've come to realise over the course of my time growing them. So number 5 on my list of plants I wish I'd never planted is the Spanish dagger, or Yucca gloriosa. Now, this is a beautiful plant. It's an evergreen shrub and it flowers at the end of the season with large spires of beautiful white flowers. An absolutely magnificent sight. It's also extremely low maintenance. It's deer and rabbit resistant and tolerates temperatures as low as -20 centigrade, which is -4 Fahrenheit. So a really good all-rounder, considering its architectural appearance that adds so much to a border. Now, it's one to be grown in full sun, in well-drained soil, and we already mentioned its hardiness. So why have I got it in for this plant? And the reason I dislike it and the reason why I'm taking it out of my garden is that I cannot stand those dagger-like prickly leaves. And if you go near this plant, for example in spring, you need to remove the lower leaves, the ones that have gone brown. You really take your life in your hands because you have to be careful that the tips of the leaves don't poke your eyes out. I highly recommend using goggles whenever you approach this beast. The leaves are difficult to remove. You do have to peel them off, which might take some effort. But just generally speaking, it's one that nobody likes to weed around, nobody likes to go near, and nobody likes to do anything with. And for that reason, I'm taking it out of my garden. Having said that, it is beautiful and it produces a large clump over time. So after it flowers, it will produce another rosette, and in the end you'll have a large clump, which can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. It gets big and unwieldy and hard to remove after a bit, so I guess that's the downside. But I am keeping the variegated form in my garden because the variegated form is less vigorous than the green and grows less big, so I will be keeping that. Right, we're now going to jump across the sea to Spain and hear from Una, hear about her 4th and 3rd plant that she wishes she'd never planted.
Hello, Una Kennedy here from the YouTube channel Granny's Garden in Spain, where I live and garden halfway up a mountain. I'm absolutely delighted to be sharing with you, with Rachel on her channel, some of my pet hates, plant hates of course. So number 4 on my list of the plants I wished I had never planted are oleander bushes. Now here in Spain, oleander bushes are planted in the middle of the road or the middle of motorways to screen the oncoming headlights. They grow fast, They grow in rocky ground, poor ground. They can withstand salt, pollution and total and utter drought. They aren't irrigated where they are, and we're talking about Spain. So they have to be tough, really tough. Those are the pros. So there was I in my first garden with young children, dogs, blissfully innocent, planting no less than 2 of these shrubs. I was still at the very, very beginning of the long learning curve to become a good gardener. So down here, I had no idea, hadn't got a clue. As I began to climb and read about it, the hairs began to stand up on my neck, and I quickly got rid of them. I had planted a ticking time bomb in the garden. Now, we all know that many plants in the garden are toxic, but this is really, really toxic, fatal toxic. All parts of the plant. If you've got sensitive skin and you rub against the leaves, it causes quite a severe rash. But it's the ingestion of very small amounts that can actually be fatal. Particularly with grazing animals, if it sort of falls, the leaf falls onto the ground and get mixed in with what they're eating. It only takes 10 small leaves to kill an adult horse or an adult cow. And we're talking about an animal that's 400 kilos. One single leaf ingested is enough to kill a 70-kilo person, man. Can you imagine a toddler? It just takes a quarter of a leaf to cause a fatality. That's how toxic it is. So you really have to be careful. Dogs tend to be quite clever. They sniff at it and they stay well away from it. But kids tend to be more stupid. They'll sort of try and stick anything in their mouths. So obviously I decided to remove them. And then I went slap bang against their biggest con, their root systems. They are deep. Loads of them and very extensive, much, much wider than the canopy itself. And worse still, they have a habit of looking for rocks and wrapping themselves round those rocks to form an anchor that is nigh impossible to pull. I have read these nightmare stories of people using a truck to get rid of the roots, wrapping a rope round it and then hooking it onto the fender and backing up, and the fender ends up falling off the truck while the offending plant remains in the ground. They are that tough. Now, recently in my daughter's garden, my husband and I set about removing 2 of the plants because she's got a young toddler, and as soon as I walked into the garden said, that plant cannot be here, it has got to go. So we spent one whole morning pulling one of the oleander plant roots out. It took us ages hacking away at it, digging, until we got it out. Even at that, I'm going to be very careful over the next year to keep looking, and as soon as I see a new plant poking up from any section of the root that's left, you pull it out, and as you keep pulling and pulling and pulling, it eventually gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and it'll eventually die out completely. But from here to a year, I'm going to have my eye set that doesn't regrow from any section of the root still left in the ground. Also, because I know the toxicity of this plant, I was working with a baseball cap, safety goggles and gloves. But at some point, because it was very hot work, I did that with my hair, and because I have sensitive skin, I created a rash, which even after a week is still there, glaring and red with spots on it. Brr, hate the plant. It is okay to work with toxic plants. A lot of the plants in the garden are toxic, but there's a difference between toxic and toxic fatal. You have to draw the line somewhere, and my line is very clear. It's definitely a no-no in my garden. Number 3 on my list, Cypress Hedge. When I bought this house 3 years ago, it had all the way down one side a Leylandii cypress hedge that had been probably planted somewhere about 20 years ago. Unfortunately, it had been heavily infected with Ceridium, and you could see parts of the hedge were already dead, and parts of it you could see diagonally going through it, Ceridium, too far gone to be able to recover. If your hedge is attacked by Ceridium and you catch it early enough, you can cut the branches out, very carefully bagging them and taking them away, and then start systematic spraying with fungicide, and it is possible to recover. Once it has really got hold, there's nothing you can do. So this last winter, my husband and I took out, over a period of weeks, about 60 or 70 of these trees, leaving it open to plant new things. I have a love-hate relationship with cypress hedges. They are definitely not for beginner gardeners. The problem is they are so dirt cheap to buy, and that's where the domino effect begins. The next biggest mistake is incorrect pruning. You should never prune a cypress hedge. Other hedges, yes, but a cypress hedge should never be pruned as a vertical wall. This hedge is 20 years old. It's always been pruned as a vertical wall. A cypress hedge is only green on those parts that receive sunlight. The top part of the hedge, all of this part up there, is green because the sun is hitting the horizontal part of the hedge. So it's green virtually all the way down as far as here. But on the vertical wall, it's a very different story. Only the outer tips are green. And if I just make a hole with my hand, like that, you'll see that on the inside, which doesn't receive any light, the branches are brown. One thing is very important to know about cypress branches. Only the green part is capable of producing more growth. The brown part, no. So anything that doesn't receive sunlight does not produce growth. So that comes the next question. If you decide when you're trimming your hedge, nah, I don't feel like having to do it twice a year. Let's do it once a year and let's shave it back even further. If you shave the green part off and you expose the brown part, you've killed your hedge, because that is not going to produce any new green growth. And I'll show you exactly in the neighbour's house exactly what I'm talking about. Ugly, isn't it? See what I mean? At some stage this was hacked back and all the brown branches were exposed. That is never going to recover, because one of the traits typical of cypress hedges, it won't recover once the brown is exposed. The top part you'll see has still got a bit of fluff. Why? The same as I explained over the other side of the garden. Because the horizontal plane, the sun penetrates very deep, and even if you cut it back, there's still green to be able to re-sprout. That's a typical example of what you should not do. So, what do you need to do with a cypress hedge? So number one is don't plant it too close to a fence or too close to a wall. And secondly, don't plant them too close together. That way the air can get in behind them and around them, and you'll have a lot healthier tree. The second is the pruning. Please do not prune a cypress into a vertical wall. It has a natural cone shape, and Mother Nature left it in a cone shape so that the sun will be able to penetrate on all levels of the plant. Meaning that the same way as you get nice deep fluff on the top, you can get nice deep fluff on the back, so you can actually shave it quite happily without ever touching those green branches. So it is a cone shaped plant. It is never meant to be like that, and you can run into trouble, and worse still, when you run into trouble you can't come back from it. This is one of the few plants in nature that once you've made a mistake, it's there forever. Also, cypress hedges are very susceptible to ceridium. Ceridium, you've got to be careful. The very second you see something slightly brown, because on cypress hedges anything slightly brown is a danger signal, warning signal, and you've got to take note and you've got to act now, not later. For me, if you see part or a branch going brown on a cypress hedge, you can bet your dollar something's going wrong. So pull it out, snip it off and ask questions later. Then start investigating. But that branch has got to go before it starts infecting everything around it. For me also, in the case of cypress hedges, I'm normally against any type of spraying. But in the case of cypress hedges, if you want a good, healthy plant, you need twice a year a preventative spray. And that way you're going to have a happy, healthy cypress hedge for many, many years to come. It is possible to have a cypress hedge and a healthy cypress hedge. Just, you need a keen eye and good pruning. What I'm going to do now is hop back onto my own channel and continue with my list of pet hates, or pet garden plant hates. Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me on your channel, and to all of you, Slán.
Wow, Una, I am so surprised to hear that about oleander. Do you know, when I got my greenhouse first, that was one of the very first plants that I bought to overwinter and keep in the greenhouse, and the blooming thing never flowered for me. And as for Leylandii hedges, oh my goodness, I mean, so many people have inherited such a hedge from, well, from whoever they got the house from originally, and they can be a real nightmare just in terms of drying out the ground all at the foot of the tree, so you can plant nothing. Anyway, enough of that, and now I'm going to move on to my second top plant. So when we say top plant, it's top because I wish I'd never planted in my garden. And this bush is Forsythia, common Forsythia. Now, we all know Forsythia. It has beautiful yellow flowers in spring, and it really is a welcome sight. It flowers at a time in the year when there isn't a whole lot else going on, and I always think that yellow in itself is such a welcome sight in spring. Many of us don't like yellow in our garden, but we'll tolerate it in spring because it really is a sign of freshness and hope and vigor and new plants for the coming year. So Forsythia in spring, yeah, we all like it, even though Forsythia itself is pretty much a one-trick pony, because that's what it does. Now, if you read the books, they will say that Forsythia can be planted as a specimen, or Forsythia can be planted as a hedge. And many years ago, I made the mistake of planting Forsythia as a hedge in my garden. And the problem with that is that it is not very malleable to pruning. Now, you're supposed to prune Forsythia after it flowers, and you're supposed to maintain the elegant shape of the bush, the integrity of the bush. Whereas if you try and clip it into a hedge shape, it just doesn't lend itself to that. And it starts resprouting, and then you're clipping it at the wrong time, and then it's growing more vigorously. And oh my goodness, an absolute nightmare in terms of providing a hedge in my garden. So I had to get rid of my Forsythia hedge a few years back, and this was a major big deal. We had to use the car and attach a rope to the bushes to try and pull them out of the ground. Not something I recommend, but it was the only way to actually get these bushes out. And in the end, we didn't get the final one out. It was just too vigorous and too firmly ensconced in the ground. So I now currently have one surviving Forsythia bush in my garden. It's a great shrub if you have space for it. It gets big, and my problem was it got far too big for any space I wanted it in. It likes sun or dappled shade, quite tolerant over soil type, and quite hardy. So, okay, if you want something that's going to give you a real wow in spring, and you have enough space for it to allow it to elegantly do its thing without being restricted, then plant Forsythia. But for me, no, it's not one I wanted. So finally, we come to my number one plant. Number one in terms of I really wish I hadn't planted in my garden. And you may be surprised to learn that this plant is a rose. It's Rosa Rugosa. Yes, I know this is going to be a really unpopular choice because so many people love roses, such a popular plant. But I can tell you that whereas roses aren't my personal favourite, Rosa Rugosa really is a different animal. What's it got going for it? Well, it has many wonderful things going for it. It produces beautiful flowers, and they're scented as well. So I originally planted hedges and hedges and hedges of Rosa Rugosa in my garden because to have a flowering scented hedge, it's just got to be the most wonderful thing. And then after it finishes flowering, the plant produces large red hips, which are very ornamental in themselves. You can even collect them and make jelly out of them if the birds don't get them first. So it's an architectural plant to a certain extent, and one that looks wonderful when planted en masse. However, I decided that not only would I plant it as a flowering hedge in my garden, but I would put it as a backdrop to a border. And Rosa Rugosa, unfortunately, is a large, spiny, sprawling bush. It suckers as well, so that the branches, the spiny branches, they come up onto the ground a foot or so away from where the original bush is. It even suckers in the grass if you're not careful. So what I found was that after a period of time, I had my backdrop of Rosa Rugosa, and then there was like a foot or 2 foot of no man's land between it and the border, just bare soil, because the roots of the Rosa Rugosa were down there, and also the overhang from the bush was kind of shading out the back of the border, so it wasn't very attractive. And just then, obviously, as we started this whole talk, I don't like prickly things. I hate things that try and gouge pieces of me out when I weed around them, and Rosa Rugosa really is something like that does that, so it had to go. And again, another one that I have removed entirely from my garden now. We're looking now at the spot where I planted Rosa Rugosa. I made a hedge, mock orange and Rosa Rugosa planted alternately, and got rid of the Rosa Rugosa element a few years back. But even still, even though it was removed several years ago, I still have suckers popping up, so I need to keep an eye out for those and rip them out when they appear. Grow Rosa Rugosa in full sun, in any soil, and it's hardy in zones 2 to 9. It really, poor thing. This plant actually looks amazing if you see it on the landscape plantings, large en masse landscape plantings. It can look amazing along the side of the road in summer with the flowers, in late summer and autumn with the hips, can look fantastic. But if you had to actually deal with it in person and weed around it and prune it in spring, it doesn't like too much pruning, just a bit, then I guarantee you also will hate this thing that looks like a giant, spiny, naked spider out there in your garden in autumn. Anyway, it's for these reasons that I dislike Rosa Rugosa and have gotten rid of it from my garden. And that brings me to the end of this video on my 5 plants I wish I hadn't planted. Now, as you've heard, a lot of them have great things going for them, and they might be perfectly suited to your garden, to your environment, and they might thrive there and bring you much joy. So this is my personal opinion. Don't take it too much to heart, but hear the information and decide what you'll do on the basis of that. I now invite you to jump over to Una's channel and check out the rest of the video. Some more of my plants, some more of her plants. And while you're over there, have a look at some of the other videos. She has a wealth of information on there about her garden in Spain. A different environment, a different climate to mine, but very interesting all the same. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you will join me at this time next week, this time and this day next week, for the next in my series of collabs, something different, another top 5, which I hope you'll enjoy. Thanks for watching. Bye.